أعزائي المشاهدين، أهلا وسهلا بكم في هذا اللقاء مع الدكتور جون ألترمان. هو نائب رئيس لمعهد الدراسات الدولية والاستراتيجية، أيضا مدير برنامج الشرق الأوسط، ومدير كرسي بريجنسكي للأمن العالمي والاستراتيجية. سبق له أن خدم في الخارجية في التخطيط السياسي، وأيضا في الكونغرس مساعد للسناتور مونيهان، وله العديد من المؤلفات تتعلق في قضايا في الشرق الأوسط، وأيضا لديه كثير من المقالات والتعليقات. ربما يكون أحد أبرز الخبراء الذين يدركون أوضاع المنطقة بشكل وافي، ولذلك نستقبله اليوم ونتحاور معه. أهلا بك.
أهلا وسهلا، أشكرك على هذا الكلام الجميل.
تسلم، أهلا. للأسف لا نستطيع أن نكمل بالعربية رغم أنك
أسهل بالنسبة لك لو تكلمنا بالإنجليزي.
Great. Let's start with the current affairs, the issue of Yemen. It was surprising that the Saudis waged this campaign, decisive campaign against Yemen. And it was not coordinated or transmitted prior that the Saudis will undertake such a military campaign.
I think what's surprising is that they were able to sustain such a large and complex campaign for as long as they have been able to do it. The idea that you can run a raid, I think nobody doubted the Saudis could run a raid on Yemen. The idea that they could have a month-long campaign against the Houthis, that they could do day after day after day of strikes, that they could replenish their weapon stocks, that they could do all the refueling and maintenance that's required to do this over time, is something which not only surprised many people in the United States, it's my understanding it surprised many people in Saudi Arabia, because they've never done something like this alone before. And they've done it with much more skill. In terms of all the things that are required for an air campaign, much more skill than most people thought they could put together.
But with the assistance of the United States, there was a planning unit in Riyadh with the United States, coordinating logistically. They're providing lots of coordination.
My understanding is it's largely on targeting, and what people in the government have told me that's partly about trying to minimize the number of civilian casualties by trying to highlight where weapons depots and other kinds of things are located, so there's not indiscriminate bombing. I think there's a lot of concern in the U.S. government. The President and others have been talking to Saudi colleagues about a need to make sure we're moving toward a political outcome, a diplomatic outcome, that there's no way to win this militarily, that ultimately you have to be positioning yourself for a political outcome, and you have to make sure that your military actions are directed toward accomplishing a political outcome. I think that's very hard to do. It's very hard for the United States to do. It's very hard for every country in the world to do. I'm not persuaded that we are well on the way toward figuring out how to coordinate military activities and political outcomes. It feels like this is a military activity. It's day after day of military activities. I don't see the politics moving. And that, to me, requires rethinking what the military actions are.
What do you think of the U.S. position, the Obama administration position? Is the Obama administration encouraged Saudi Arabia to conduct this campaign, or Saudi Arabia insisted that we are going to do it and we would like you to come on board? That's why there is no, like you said, I mean, what the military campaign achieved so far, and there is any opening for political resolution?
Well, what it's achieved is the Houthis don't control Yemen, don't control Aden, the Houthis don't control all of the country. I think you could argue that there are some outcomes that are different now than they would have been a month ago had there been no campaign. But we certainly don't seem to be moving any closer toward having some sort of political deal in Yemen that brings everybody to the table. I think the U.S. government is split. There's some people who say we have to support the Saudis because they're helping us in any number of issues, and we have to reassure them after we're making a nuclear deal, or seem to be making a nuclear deal with the Iranians. There are other people who say this may turn out to be one of the largest complex humanitarian catastrophes we've seen in quite some time. It is driven by military action. And the United States becomes complicit if we're providing targeting and we're providing other kinds of support. So I think there are some people who say the U.S. has to be directing the Saudis more. There are some people who say, no, the Saudis have to take responsibility for their own security, and once you give them the responsibility, you can't control the outcomes. So I actually think that this is part of a broader conversation in both the Saudi government and the United States government. If the United States isn't going to be responsible for the security of Saudi Arabia in every respect, then what happens when Americans and Saudis have different views about what contributes to the security of Saudi Arabia? And I think we are seeing that playing out in Yemen now. It's certainly something I'm talking a lot with my colleagues at CSS about, because this is a big issue. Where the U.S. has provided a lot of Saudi Arabia's military capability. Saudi Arabia has decided independently to use that military capability in a way that I think is not what the U.S. would necessarily endorse. So what do you do about that difference? And I think the U.S. government and others are trying to figure out what to do about it.
So what do you think the outcome, how this campaign is going, and when and how the breakthrough toward negotiation or negotiated settlement or real ceasefire could occur?
First, I don't know enough about what's happening in the diplomacy. There certainly seems to have been an effort to send messages through the Iranians to the Houthis. There certainly the U.S. is talking directly with the Saudis. General Austin spent a day in Riyadh trying to sort of get the Saudis to think in a little different way about the political outcomes. I think you'll see other countries getting involved. There are a lot of parties here, and I think the parties are not all in the same place. There's a fear that this all represents Iranian expansion, that this is a manifestation of Iranian aggression in the region. And when that's the assumption that many of the combatants have, it takes more than just say, well, let's just all go back to our corners, because there's a sense that this represents an Iranian attack. It's going to take some time to work, and I don't think anybody has figured out exactly how to influence the Houthis. I mean, they're not a government. They are not completely reliant on Iran, but they certainly get support from Iran. Are there other sources of influence? Are there other people I talk to? We don't really know. I certainly don't know. And it's a big issue.
To what extent the internal domestic situation in Saudi Arabia has any influence on the events occur? Because we saw this kind of changes in the leadership occurring just during the campaign. The campaign is still going on with Yemen, and we see those new changes occurring.
I think things like this are probably decided by the family. I don't think any one individual does things. What we certainly see is we see the Minister of Defense, Mohammed bin Salman, associating himself with this as one of his great personal responsibilities. But I think it would be a mistake to suggest that this is his personal vendetta or this is his private purview. Everything I hear when I talk to people in various regional governments and in the U.S. government suggests that he may be out in front, but there are lots of people, and there don't seem to be divisions within the government, in the Saudi government, over what to do and how to do it.
I want to ask you a little bit about the Obama administration open criticism of the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia. There was some, in many instances, Obama lately indicated some sort of criticism. He criticized the Saudis or the Gulf states about their influence or lack of influence in Libya. He criticized them about, we're going to talk about Syria separately, but about also why they're not doing more about Syria. But mainly, the biggest issue, he said, the threat to the Gulf states is not a potential invasion from Iran. It is domestic, internal dissatisfaction with the regimes. Do you agree with the Obama administration, and to what extent this kind of open criticism you think it's helpful to the US-GCC relation in light of the upcoming summit coming at Camp David?
Well, I think there are clearly two sets of challenges for the Gulf countries, and I've written, actually 2 or 3 years ago, I wrote a piece that argued that the major security threat is an internal threat. That's not to say there aren't external threats that are serious. I think there are external threats that are serious. Iranian regional behavior has certainly unsettled many of these governments. They are conservative governments. They are cautious about change, and that both manifests in their reaction to Iranian regional activities and also in reaction to domestic changes going on. I think the president didn't say it because he wanted to make them feel good. The president said it because he thinks it's true. It's not intended to help shape the summit. It is a reaction. I'm sorry, it's a reality in his view, and that's, honest. Friends are honest with each other.
Do you think the GCC countries are doing things in that direction to alleviate the internal threat?
No, they certainly are. And I think one of the most interesting things happening in the GCC now is there's compulsory military conscription in the United Arab Emirates. 9 months, and it is partly about teaching people work ethic and partly about teaching people nationalism and moderation. It's a combination of a whole series of things. But it seems to me clearly oriented toward dealing with a sense that the domestic population has taken too much for granted in a world where you can't afford to take things for granted.
We're going to continue our discussion with a short break, and we're going to continue to discuss the expectation of this summit that coming with the GCC. أعزائي المشاهدين، فاصل قصير ونعود للحوار مع الدكتور ألترمان. أهلا وسهلا أعزائي المشاهدين، نتابع حوارنا مع الدكتور ألترمان. Dr. Altman, before the break, we were talking about the expectation. What's in your mind the expectation of the GCC from this unusual meeting at the Camp David? I mean, he's not meeting bilateral with the GCC leadership. He's meeting together. What's the expectation of the administration in your mind, and what's the expectation of the GCC?
Well, this is having to do largely with addressing the fear of people in the Gulf that the U.S. has lost interest in the Gulf. And people read the U.S. rebalance toward Asia, combined with the rise of domestic energy resources in the United States, combined with fatigue after a decade of war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And they say the U.S. is not serious about the region, that the U.S. deal with the Iranians over the nuclear program as a way to withdraw from the region. And I think what the administration is trying to do is say, no, we're going to explain to you what we really mean, and we're going to make a commitment that you can take to the bank. What the nature of that commitment will be, whether it changes in the process of negotiations, whether the Gulf leaders consider it adequate, whether it just seems to be words, or whether people think it really represents the intention of the United States, is all to be determined. There will be discussion about Yemen, there will be discussion about how the U.S. sees the world, how the U.S. sees the role in the world, what the nuclear deal means. But I think ultimately there's a sense in the Gulf that the U.S. is abandoning the seriousness of the commitment that it has made to Gulf security and to the security of these states for 4 decades. And the administration will try to shape expectations in ways they think reflects the reality of the situation.
One also issue could be discussed is Syria, and I want to remind you that President Obama mentioned something that people thought that it is like calling GCC to intervene or expand their intervention in Syria. I'm going to just quote something. Why is that, President Obama, why is that we can't have Arabs fighting the terrible human rights abuses that have been perpetrated, or fighting against what Assad has done? So do you think with the kind of development on the ground in Syria, in Jisr al-Shuhur, in Idlib, that there is some advances from the groups there, and there is some coordination, new coordination between Saudi and Turkey and Qatar more than in the past? What do you think would be the position of United States vis-a-vis Syria? If there is going to be any shift here?
I mean, there certainly has been more coordination between the Emiratis, the Qataris and the Saudis, certainly, and the Turks than there's been. I don't know what to make of the news reports that the regime is more embattled than it's ever been. I can't tell if that is reality or if that's spin. There have been a number of signs of conflict inside Syria. People have been beaten to death who used to be senior in the government. What that all means in terms of where the regime is the regime feeling it has to circle the wagons? Are they feeling like they need a lifeline? I don't know where any of it is. I'm not sure people do. To me, there has long been a consensus in the United States that this ultimately has to be decided through a negotiation, the outcome of which will be some government in Syria which will have elements of the current government and elements of the current opposition, and probably some degree of decentralization.
The element from the government including President Assad?
It is hard for me to see how President Assad himself can stay in power after all that he's done, I mean, especially after the chemical weapons attacks, but not exclusively after the chemical weapons attacks. But I think everybody also understands that there are a lot of dangerous people in Syria on both sides.
But the chemical attacks, he was accused, or the government was accused, but also the other groups, the opposition military groups, they were accused of using chemical weapons too. I mean, there was no decisive...
No, that's what I said, is there will be elements of both the current government and elements of the opposition. I think that President Assad has behaved in such a way that it would be very hard for the world and for a large percentage of his population to think it's an acceptable settlement for him to remain in power. At the same time, there are certainly people on the other side who would not be acceptable to be in power.
The opposition are calling for safe havens or safe areas in the north in particular. Do you think the United States is going to change its position, this administration, with what's going on the ground and with the call for the GCC countries to be more aggressive in intervening? Do you think this idea would have any chance of being implemented?
I don't know I haven't spoken to anybody about safe havens for a while, so I'm not sure where the current thinking is. As I said, I think ultimately where you have to go is towards some sort of negotiation which meets the minimum needs of everybody and the maximum needs of nobody. And I've been hearing more in the Gulf about a willingness to explore that. I think you've seen Secretary Kerry being more explicit about how that's the outcome, and one of the challenges is figuring out if there's anybody on the government side who you can talk to and work through some of these issues.
Dr. Alterman, I want to ask you a general question about what happened in Yemen and what happening in Syria is kind of Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria and Al-Qaeda in the Gulf, and they are expanding their influence. They are growing their strength, while there is a coalition against Al-Qaeda and its affiliation, ISIS and others. Do you think this is helping the administration and helping also the coalition to fight terrorism and to fight, and actually it's helping terrorism by the kind of policy being implemented?
The jihadis exist in places where there are proxy wars, right? And so there are proxy wars, and the jihadis are in between, or sometimes they're supported by one side or another. The United States is not supporting jihadis anywhere, but the U.S. has different attitudes toward proxy wars, and certainly U.S. allies are supporting at least one side in all these proxy wars, and sometimes both sides. I have tried to argue to people that there's a problem with having all these regional proxy wars, and that is that you're seeing jihadi groups arise from the middle of them. But Iran is an actor in many of these proxy wars, and certainly one of the possibilities is if there's progress on a nuclear agreement, and I'm not sure we'll have a complete agreement, but we may have progress, we may have more negotiations, that there are opportunities to address a whole series of other issues. And I know that Secretary Kerry and Minister Zarif had conversations about this in New York. The United States and Iran share some interests, as the U.S. shares with the GCC states, and Iran becoming a more responsible actor, dealing with some of these jihadi threats, is certainly something to be pursued in the future. Not that Iran is supporting the jihadis, but that the Iranian-supported fighters and other fighters create the common ground in which jihadis can operate, posing a threat to the stability of everybody.
Quickly, last question. What the chances of the agreement with Iran on the nuclear issue to be concluded, do you think?
You know, I think we can get an agreement. I'm less confident we can get the agreement. It's my sense that where we're going with that is we'll be able to take care of a large number of issues, but ultimately we're going to be negotiating with the Iranians. The Iranians are going to be negotiating with us. There are going to be all sorts of issues about the kinds of inspections and what the inspections find and everything else. But if we're in a process that is leading toward A, us talking, and B, the Iranians becoming more transparent over time, I think that's a useful direction to head in, even if you can't fix the problem. To me, if you think you're going to fix the issue of the U.S.-Iran relationship, you're going to be disappointed. But can you create a pattern where it improves? I think we certainly can.
Well, unfortunately, we are running out of time, and you have other commitment. We honor them. أعزائي المشاهدين، شكرا لحسن استماعكم، وسيكون لنا لقاءات قادمة مع شخصيات مثل الدكتور ألترمان. شكرا لإصغائكم وإلى اللقاء. Thank you.
تمام.
Thank you very much.
أهلا وسهلا. Good to see you.
Good to see you.